Hello, and welcome to the first episode of our book club series of the Framlingham College In Conversation podcast. My name is Tessa Hawes, and I'm the current graduate scholar here at the college, and I'm delighted to be joined by Mr. Salisbury, our head of philosophy, and Edgar, our prefect in charge of learning, for this Philosophy 101 episode. I wanted to start this series with philosophy, as we have World Philosophy Day approaching on the 21st of November, as well as it being Non-Fiction November. So let's begin our discussion. What is philosophy's purpose?
So every philosopher has a different view on this. I will disagree with Russell on this, I think, to a certain extent, who we will be discussing in this podcast. For me, simply put, it's the pursuit of truth. It's wanting to ask questions like, what is justice? With the aim of being able to provide an answer to that question, which hopefully will be an objective answer, or at the very least a useful answer. There's a lot of debate about whether it's done for its own sake. For me, I find myself in that camp, that philosophy should be done because it's philosophy and not whether it actually contributes to some further goal, like human flourishing. It can do that as a side effect, but for me, the purpose of philosophy is to discover answers to questions and to provide a framework, a methodology to make that happen.
I agree. So why did we choose this book? Why did we choose The Problems of Philosophy by Bertrand Russell?
So Russell's Problems of Philosophy is it was published in 1912. It's very often described as a very accessible book in terms of some of the problems that philosophy faces. It's an introductory text for a lot of university students, and so it's kind of always viewed in that way. He's a very clear writer. He doesn't try to confuse his readers too much. He wants them to really understand what the problems are. It's a very well read book. It's sold over 100,000 copies, and it will have been read countless more times than that by many philosophy students over and over again. But it does do more than just that. It does something that I think is quite important within philosophy, which is to get us to question our instinctive beliefs, things like, is there a real world out there? These are beliefs that we grow up just having without even having consciously thought, is there a world out there or not? So he wants us to be open to subjecting those beliefs to investigation, and that can lead to potentially accepting quite counterintuitive beliefs. So I think it's a great book for introductions into the problems, but also helping people to go about challenging their preconceived notions of what is true or what is the reality of the world.
Yeah, I'd certainly say it's way more accessible than Wittgenstein.
Or something
like
that. Yes. Don't start with Wittgenstein at all. Yeah, no.
So just a background on Russell and why he in particular is an important philosopher.
Yeah, so Russell's quite a significant figure within various movements. He spans a lot of the territory of philosophy, so things like logic, things like ethics, epistemology, the philosophy of mathematics as well. So he kind of is across a lot of the topics that you would study. He's a great contributor to what we call analytic philosophy, which is where we focus a lot more on logic and language, and so he's a great contributor to that tradition. And that dominates Western philosophy. There's always debate about whether that should be the dominant tradition, but he's a great contributor to that. He's just a very well-known, prominent figure within those fields, and he's really helped to widen the circle of interest in philosophy. And some of his other book, The History of Western Philosophy, which is a bigger book, and it spans the history of Western philosophy, again, is a seminal text that lots of students will read. So he has expanded the reach of philosophy, which is great.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so before we delve into whether it's possible to know something exists, I think it would be a good idea to give a summary of chapter 1, 2 and 3 of the problems of philosophy, just to give a background and basis to help students understand what this book's about. So yeah, Mr. Salisbury, do you want to give us a summary?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a great little book, and we're only going to really actually look at the first 3 chapters, which aren't that long, and that's one of the beautiful things about it. You can pick it up, read it for a bit, and get a lot from it. But yeah, chapter 1 is essentially what Russell wants us to do is to illustrate a distinction between what's called appearance and reality. And so he just tries to demonstrate that there is this distinction to be made. The theory that kind of signifies in philosophy is called indirect realism. We don't need to get into the weeds of that, but that's the kind of theory that he's trying to propose there. In chapter 2, he then gets into the discussion of the existence of matter itself and whether there is any such thing as matter. And within that, he will introduce things like the what we call primary and secondary qualities. Again, that's just a kind of another aspect to it. Within that, there is this kind of phrasing in philosophy that we call mind dependence and mind independence. And so things that whether there is a mind independent world, a world that exists beyond the mind. And then in chapter 3, I like to look at that as saying, well, we are going to be accepting that there is an external world, so matter does exist. But even if it does, you then have to question, what is that stuff? What is the nature of that stuff that exists? And then this is where we introduce this term called the veil of perception, which is a quite nice thing we might talk about.
That's a nice term.
Yeah,
brilliant. Okay, so let's get into it. Philosophy 101 breakdown. Is it possible to know something exists? So let's start with chapter 1. Edgar, what would you say is a central problem that Russell presents in chapter 1 regarding our perception of everyday objects like a table?
So Russell's use of a table is essentially to question whether what we see is or matches what actually exists in reality. And he draws a distinction between appearance and reality. Everybody can see a table in appearance, and he raises the problem of perceptual variation, that despite the fact that we say the object is the same and we're all perceiving the object, at the same time we all see something different. There's a different colour, different texture depending on what part of a table we touch. And in a different light, the table will look different. So how can we claim that this particular table that we're seeing, the table as it appears, is the actual table, since it's clearly not constant throughout our own perceptions of it and through different people's perceptions of it? And that's how he draws this fundamental distinction for his indirect realist argument, as Mr. Salisbury said.
Yeah, so it's to do with our senses and kind of how, say, if I'm sitting at this table now, I might see the table differently how you see the table, because different shadows are reflecting on the table differently for me. So my perception of this table is different from yours, and that's where this real idea of is this table real comes from. Would you agree?
Yeah, and it's also the fact that we shouldn't really be privileging one of those over any other. You know, the way the table looks to us in a certain type of light is just the way it looks in that certain type of light. To say that is the right way to see the table, as opposed to when the light's off, or if you're in different circumstances, then to claim that one of those should be privileged, Russell says there's no reason to.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And so you have to then question, well, if you're not seeing it as it is in that kind of reality, then you must be only kind of having the appearance of that object. And yeah, he talks about, as Edgar said, the touch, the feel of the table, the way it looks, the shape of the table as well, because the shapes can change depending on your relation to them as an observer. Because that's an important point, isn't it, Edgar? The observer. Maybe you want to sort of talk about the role of the observer in that.
Russell makes the claim that we have senses and we gain sensations from the particular objects, and then from those sensations we get sense data. So that's going to be if you think about it in sight, that's going to be like a picture of a table, essentially one frame of the perception of the table, and that particular sense data that rests in the mind and the mind alone. So when Russell later goes on to talk about what we call the veil of perception, then it essentially is the claim that we're prevented from seeing beyond a mind-dependent world. So everything that we see, all of these images, these sounds, they're all mind-dependent. They're all based in our heads and our heads alone. So that is used to cast doubt, or at least some kind of skepticism on the existence of the world itself. And all of this links in quite well with Russell's desire to challenge those basic instincts, that we assume that our perception is direct. We see the world as it is, when in fact the observer will only be able to perceive the sense data, which, well, you can then make various arguments where that sense data comes from, and Russell reckons that it's from the objects themselves causing the sensations.
And I think with us as observers, I mean, I think we get caught in this trap as human beings in many areas of our beliefs, and it's the sort of accepting that we must as human beings have that kind of accurate representation of reality. There's no doubt that we have some form of accurate way of perceiving the world. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be here.
No, that's true.
So there's a kind of an argument that works there. But to claim that just because of our biology, such that it is, we have perceptual systems, we have sight, we have vision.
And there's differences between every person's sight and so someone might be colorblind, so their perception of that table might be different to another person who isn't colorblind, and therefore that appearance is not necessarily the reality, because every person's table, metaphorically speaking, is different.
Exactly that, and to privilege one over the other would be you'd have to do more than just say, well, ours is correct.
You
have to give a good argument as to why one, and you can apply that then to not just between humans but between species, in terms of how an octopus perceives the world, or some other creature that has a radically different kind of understanding of how the world, and the idea of survival within that sort of gets negated, because there are lots of species who perceive the world very differently, and they do very well in the world. They don't perceive it the way we do, but still survive. So they're obviously tuned for fitness within that system as well. An
interesting concept. So shall we move on to chapter 2 and discuss whether there is such a thing as matter? So when talking of an object's matter, what is the difference between the existence of sense data of an object and the physical existence of an object itself? What's that difference?
Well, it's a very important difference. If we want to say that the external world exists, then there are objects occupying space. They have certain properties to them. But when we talk about sense data, we're talking about either the properties we get from them, or just some kind of, it could be anything really. It doesn't have to be related. That you have to almost force a relation between the two. You have to make some kind of argument, which Russell tries to do in this chapter. So the key difference between sense data and actual existent objects is that the existent objects are much more constant. They don't depend on a mind. They don't depend on an observer. They continue regardless. And the issue of the veil of perception, as I was perhaps getting onto a bit too earlier before, means that you don't know, the sense data doesn't have to necessarily mean that there are these actual objects. But Russell argues that it's the most logical, most actually perhaps not just most logical, probably most sensible, most almost
reasonable.
Reasonable. Really, it's that objects do exist, and he uses the example of a cat moving from place to place.
I was thinking of that one.
And becoming hungry. How can it do that unless there's some kind of constant object that is becoming hungry or is moving from place to place? But of course, Russell has to admit that he can't be certain about that.
No.
He has to assume, and all you can do is assume. Because Russell's taken us from the direct realist point of view, which is that we are perceiving the world directly, to the indirect realist. But once you get there, there's not much proof that realism is correct. It's just,
I mean, it might just be worth just me reading this bit, because that kind of summarizes what Edgar said from Russell himself. So he says in chapter 2, there is no logical impossibility in the supposition that the whole of life is a dream. So he's really clearly saying, look, it's possible.
Yeah.
Right? We can't rule it out as an argument. We can't prove via logical means that there is no sort of a chance of this happening. But although this is not logically impossible, there is no reason whatever to suppose that it is true. So he kind of says, well, look, yes, I have to admit that I can't rule it out, but there's no good reason to assume it's true. And then he uses this lovely sort of phrase, in fact, and it is, in fact, a less simple hypothesis. And what he means by that is essentially that if we're going to explain our experience of the world and explain how we are able to have these, vision, see by vision, and hear things and taste things and all that kind of stuff, you've got to get down to something that explains it well and is a better hypothesis. And as Edgar said, it's like, well, what are you going to go with? Are you going to go, because we could then get into the conversation about whether, okay, we could be in a simulation, and to be fair, there's a lot of scope for and a lot of philosophers who would want to defend that position, but Russell kind of, Russell's writing before that this is sort of a mainstream belief, right, in terms of like whether that could be the case. Simulations were not necessarily as prominent in his day, but this idea that it's a simpler explanation for how we perceive the world, that there is an object out there, it exists, and it's causing that perception.
So, like, for example, drawing back to the cat, if the cat were just like a set of sense data, it would make sense to explain its behavior, or like the need, like its hunger and things like that. It would be better to realize that the cat does exist outside of just our sense data, rather than I don't. You're exactly right. It's a better explanation. Yes,
a better explanation to say that it's there, and then when you leave for work,
it's still hungry.
It's still there, and
it still exists.
It's still existing. It's getting hungry because its biology means that it gets hungry, and then when but there's no reason, and this is why he's saying it's not an illogical impossibility. There's no reason to suggest that could not just be some part of some simulation that for whatever reason the simulators want you as the being to think your cat has become hungry over time. That is a possibility. In fact, Russell calls it an uncomfortable possibility, which is another one of his nice phrases. Yeah. Okay,
so shall we move on to chapter 3 and discuss the nature of matter? So we discussed a bit about the existence of a sense data and an object, but let's talk about what the relationship between sense data and their physical counterparts is, and why might it be difficult to determine the nature of an object because of this relationship.
So Russell's now made the case that objects do exist in reality. So determining their characteristics can only really be done through the senses and gaining sense data. Of course, there are problems in gaining sense data, but they seem to, senses seem to, the correct word would be to cohere in such a fashion that at the very least we can distinguish one from another with their certain characteristics. But there's always the problem that these characteristics do not meet their real counterparts.
Yeah, and whilst he doesn't sort of rule out the possibility, yes, as Edgar said, at this point we're kind of accepting that there is a world out there. It's the best hypothesis, it's the best explanation. But then you are left with this nature of the matter problem, which is the veil, and Edgar's mentioned it a couple of times, but the veil of perception, you can't move beyond the sense data that you are receiving. So you can't get access to the actual matter that causes your perceptions. We are unable to move beyond that veil of perception, and therefore you never be able to do this kind of comparison.
Yeah.
You know, if you were an all-powerful being, an omniscient being who could see the world as both reality and appearance, you could look at them both and sort of say, well, they look the same, or different potentially, because there's no reason why they wouldn't be completely radically different.
Yeah.
But we are just trapped within our own perceptual framework. We're trapped within that biological sort of apparatus that we have. Our eyes will only give us what our eyes can see. We are not able to see lots of different things, whereas other animals are, and our hearing is radically different to other animals and that sort of thing. So we are only given the tools of our perception such as we have them, and to believe that we can move beyond those is in fact an impossibility, I guess. Russell was saying. So then we have to kind of think, well, how likely is it that the nature of the matter that causes our perceptions is the way we think it is? Yeah.
It's certainly a difficult thing to think about, and I think that's the key thing what philosophy raises, like the whole, is there a possible existence of something outside of our perception of it? So, for example, like colour or sounds, there's sound waves that we can't see. Is that what you're going along with the veil perception idea? That we can't see light waves, we can't see sound waves. So how can that make sense to us visually?
Well, that's one of the principal problems with indirect realism or using perception. I don't think this is Russell. I know he goes on to talk about ether, which I remember quite well. But if you take Russell's position as being, as there are objects in the world, but we don't perceive them directly, you then have to consider what are the properties of these objects and how do they cause our sensations. And this is going back to my philosophy classwork, which is that, so you have John Locke, who proposed the idea of primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are these essential properties of the object themselves. And so for example, sound waves, that's going to be, I suppose, well, this would be a visualization of it, but you can imagine the sound wave on an oscilloscope, right? The drawing of that. So that's a primary quality of the sound wave, but it causes some sensation in you, and that is, well, that's the secondary quality. Locke calls them but powers in the object, which is very confusing, but the ability to cause certain sensations, and that is one of the big problems with the veil of perception, because you could say we sort of, well, you can make the assumption or an inference that we have access to the primary quality, so the shape, we've deduced that a sound wave behaves like this. But because we principally only have access to the sense data, that means that we can't be entirely too sure whether these primary qualities do in fact exist, because when we say we see a primary quality like shape, that's more likely just some kind of aggregate of the color of that object. So, well, really on top of that, also, as soon as we bring in science, we've already made many assumptions ourselves. The scientists have to be indirect realists, probably. I don't think direct realism really works in science because of time lag.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah.
It can't work.
Yeah, I mean, just to quickly build on that, is that the time lag idea is that, with the sun's a perfect example. When you're looking at the sun, you're not seeing it as it is now. It's 8 minutes. The light from the sun takes 8 minutes to get to you. So yeah, it's hard to defend a direct realist account of the world because there are these kind of concerns. Yeah, the thing that Russell says in this chapter that I thought would be worth, and it ties in with what Edgar was saying, is that though physical objects cannot be exactly like sense data.
Yes.
So he's kind of saying, well, actually, to assume that, and as you were saying, that like a light wave or a sound wave is exactly like the sound or the thing that you expect, the color, they're not, right? The light wave that represents the color red looks nothing like red. You know, so it can't be exactly like it. Otherwise, it would be red, and you would. But we know that's not the case.
Yes.
So then he has to say, well, but they may be more or less like.
Yes.
So he has to kind of accept that we'll never know, but we can make an assumption that they must be more or less like that. Otherwise, you know, what are we doing here? We're kind of, because then you're open to anything.
Then things get way too confusing. It's just
it's not even confusing, because then it just gets silly almost to a certain extent. It does, because you say, well, okay, I'm looking at the table that looks red, but actually in reality it's just a bunch of, I don't know, feathers or something. You know, because you could just it wouldn't matter. There wouldn't have to be any corresponding relationship between the matter in the world and the sense data. Yeah. If you open it up to that kind of range of possibility. Yeah.
I'd agree with that. But should we round off by saying or concluding whether we do think it is possible to know whether something exists? What are our personal thoughts?
I mean, having taught this many years and have studied it myself and also at university, I'm. It's hard to move away from Russell's position.
Yes.
It's a difficult. It's still a difficult question to answer. I would say that personally, I'm more inclined to explore the idea that actually we are not perceiving reality as it is. Does that negate the fact that there is a reality? Does that negate the fact that there's an external world? Probably not. But I don't think there's. I think there's, as Russell says, there's good reasons to suppose that what I see is not what it's like in reality. So the nature of the matter is probably different to what I perceive. But even further than that, I think there are good reasons. There are plenty of philosophers and arguments out there to support the idea that actually we are tuned, in terms of evolutionarily tuned, to not see reality as it is. And if we did, we'd go extinct.
Wow.
I'd love to have the time to get into that here, but so I'm moving more in that direction, that from an evolutionary perspective, and when you're in the realms of evolution and biology, to a certain extent, you can start to think that it's grounded in something more secure than maybe some of the philosophical arguments. So using science and biology and evolution to try and sort of support and provide a foundation for a belief that actually it would be an impossibility to see the world as it actually is in reality. Yeah, that's where I'm sort of currently existing.
Wow.
Yeah. Edgar?
I get the same sentiments really, but I think it's also interesting because you really can't be sure whether anything exists. Everybody tends to prefer to pretend that we can be certain that it exists, but of course we don't know the nature of it. But we assume the nature, and whilst these are all problems, at the same time, you're not going to be able to. It is the nature of the problem that you're not going to be able to
That's
go
what
through your
philosophy
life.
is.
You're not going to be able to go through your life and think, does this exist or not? Because you just have to keep going as you are.
But you have to keep questioning.
Yeah, but it does raise, or it shows how important philosophy is really, when we consider the sciences being based on the scientific method, which is based on using our senses to reach conclusions, how based they are on this one specific theory of the existence of the world. And if any alternative were possible, like a simulation, we could question science entirely. But people spend their entire lives looking into science, but it's only based on this quite tenuous possibility of the existence of the external world.
I think if Edgar's making the claim that you should study philosophy over science, I agree with him.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, more than welcome.
Yeah.
It's
Thank
very
you
enjoyable.
for listening, and thank you, Mr. Salisbury. Thank you, Edgar. And I hope this gets people looking more into the problems of philosophy and philosophy in general.
Yeah, pick up the book, go and read it. It's a great book, it really is.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much.